Thank you, David, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Maude and to Moment Magazine for bringing us together. Most of all, thanks to all of you for being here. I really look forward to speaking with you and hearing from you. So, as you know, 2020 is the centennial year of women's suffrage in the United States, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment ensuring women's right to vote. Now, the amendment was not perfect. African-American women and men in southern states had to wait until 1965, passage of the Voting Rights Act, for their own constitutional rights to be secure. But this year, we can celebrate the 72-year-long fight for the 19th Amendment, a big step toward that more perfect union the Constitution tells us is our goal. And by the way, when you know history, you never say that women were given the vote in 1920 or any year. Women organized, they strategized, they mobilized, and yes, they fought for the right. They used the tools of democracy to strengthen democracy. And that's a message for us all. Suffrage was at once a nationwide reform movement and a political campaign that got fought state by state on the ground. And speaking as an old vote counter who's examined many campaign returns, wins and losses, and when I started examining the election results for suffrage, I noticed something remarkable, an unmistakable but unnoticed pattern. American Jews, even though we were and are a fraction of the population, was central to the fight for the vote and the victory. In fact, as I looked at the last crucial 5 years of the suffrage campaign, I realized that Jewish leadership and Jewish votes were essential to victory. I think that's an important story. It's one that's absent from the history books. It's one I'd like to share with you today. Here's why. In 1915, the suffrage movement was in trouble. Referenda were held in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and in every one of those states, suffrage was defeated. Now, suffrage, like so many social advances in American history, actually moved from west to east, began in the frontier towns of Wyoming and Colorado, through to the wins in the Midwest, actually even winning presidential suffrage in Illinois, but it was rejected by every large eastern state where it was on the ballot in 1915. And if suffrage couldn't win in the East, it couldn't win nationwide. Now, most of the states that were lost in 1915 had rules restricting when the question could be back on the ballot. There was only one path open, and that was to go back to New York and try again. The good news was that the New York Suffrage Party had built an extensive political network with committed, experienced co-workers. Incidentally, New York, not so incidentally, New York was also the home of America's largest immigrant population and the largest number of Jews. Now that made some people nervous. Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was the daughter of famed women's rights leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first person to call publicly for women to vote in 1848. But her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, was so angry at the thought that she would have to appeal once again to immigrants for her rights. And by immigrants, she meant Jews. Harriet Blatch walked away from the New York campaign. Fortunately, other suffrage leaders, women and men, did not share her prejudice. In fact, in New York, a lot of them were Jews. And they were determined to fight again and win. And so they did. After a hard-fought, city by city, town by town, block by block campaign, when the polls closed on November 6, 1917, not only was there a majority for women's suffrage in New York State, but the margin for victory came within New York City, the immigrants' home. That's right. Outside the city, suffrage failed. Even in Rochester, where Susan B. Anthony had lived and was revered for so many years, Even Rochester voted against suffrage, but the city voted yes. And the highest pro-suffrage margins came from the Jewish districts. Records show that of the 100 top pro-suffrage districts in New York City, 78 were Jewish, 78 out of 100. And within those Jewish districts, 76 to 93% of the total vote cast was yes on suffrage. Now, that vote in New York, which was then the largest state with the highest number of votes in the Electoral College, gave new optimism, new impetus to the national campaign. It moved the balance of political power toward suffrage. After all, good politicians can count. And what they saw after New York State was that suffrage was coming, and smart politicians want to be on the winning side. It's New York's Jews, many of them immigrants to the United States, who value the chance to be citizens here as they never could be in the old country. It was the Jews of New York who made the difference and won the state. It was the votes of Jewish men, I mean, obviously, because only men could vote in that 1917 election. It was the votes of Jewish men and the voices and the work of Jewish women who tipped the balance, who ensured that the rights of citizenship would be extended to American women. So that's the story I want all of us to think about and to understand. The New York election, 1917, not the only time that American Jews stepped forward and took the lead for suffrage. In other states, in Congress, and even in the dramatic last-minute ratification of the 19th Amendment, American Jews made the difference. This is history we should be proud of. It's history you should know. So let me introduce you to some of my personal heroes, American Jews, women and men, whose leadership and determination helped win the fight for the vote. So my first example is Rose Schneiderman. Rose Schneiderman, for Rose, it's the classic immigrant story. Her family comes to the United States from Poland in 1890. Rose is 10 years old. They lived in a tenement on the Lower East Side with the kitchen serves as a living room by day and a bedroom at night. And 3 years after they came to the US, her father died. And although mother hoped to keep her in school, Rose had to go to work to bring home enough to help the family eat. She goes to work in a factory. She's 13 years old. She has to pay, by the way, for her own sewing machine at $1 a week. And she's sewing linings for men's caps. To win better treatment, Rose organizes a local of the Hat and Cap Makers Union. And the other workers, seeing her, watching her organize, are so impressed by her leadership, they elect her a delegate to the Central Labor Council. Rose is on her way as a leader. And Rose realizes something else from her own experience, that women need to organize, and for their own protection, they need to be able to vote. Suffrage, the power of the vote, isn't just a theory for Rose Schneiderman and the women she knows. They've had hard, painful experience. In 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City kills 146, mostly young immigrant girls, working in a factory where fire engine ladders couldn't reach the top floors, and the fire doors were locked to keep the workers in and the union organizers out. When Rose speaks at the memorial for the murdered workers, her words and emotions are so compelling that even though she's speaking in Yiddish, a language from her heart and one that most of her listeners understood, she is translated and carried in the New York Times. And the Times tells us, she says, "We have tried you, citizens. We are trying you now. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred." 1 year after speaking for the victims of the Triangle Fire, whose lives were held so cheap because they had no power to protect themselves, Rose Schneiderman went to work full-time for suffrage. She said, "I think that I was born a suffragist, but if I hadn't been, I am sure that the conditions of working girls in New York would have made me one. Speaking in Yiddish and in English, Rose campaigned on street corners, outside factories, inside when they'd let her in, outside when she had to reach the workers on their way in. She spoke inside tenements, in open parks, and on fancy estates. She became a leader in the Women's Trade Union League, which was a coalition of working and middle-class women. And even after the victory for suffrage in 1917, Rose kept working with her Women's Trade Union League partners on projects that could build better lives for working women. In 1921, Rose was invited by one of the women she met at the WTUL to a small informal dinner, where she met her hostess's husband, a charming, politically ambitious young man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Rose became one of FDR's advisors. I'd say she was one of the only members of the New Deal Brain Trust who really knew what factory life and working life was like. For Rose Schneiderman and Eleanor Roosevelt, that was the beginning of a friendship that continued through both their lives. There are pictures of Eleanor Roosevelt at Women's Trade Union League dinners, and she is quite a bit taller than Rose, standing together in a joint venture. For Rose, it was the beginning of her official life, as she went on to be appointed to a number of offices, including, for example, New York Secretary of Labor, where she worked to extend Social Security for domestic workers and equal pay for women workers. I say that because it kind of sounds familiar as an agenda. So here's my first hero, a Yiddish-speaking immigrant, just 4 feet 9 inches tall, with only a few years of school, who gave speeches for suffrage and union organizing on street corners, standing outside factories, standing on soapboxes and ladders. When you're 4 feet 9 inches tall, you stand on a ladder so you can be seen as well as heard. Who goes to family lunches at Hyde Park and dinners at the White House, speaks at banquet halls and on national radio broadcasts. But wherever she is, however she's speaking, Rose Schneiderman is a voice of working women wherever she goes. Next, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. Now, you've probably heard the name because the synagogue that Rabbi Wise founded in New York is now named for him. And there's another in California named in his honor. You may recognize Rabbi Wise as one of the founders of the American Jewish Congress and of the World Jewish Congress. Did you know he was also a founder and co-chair of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage? How important is that? Well, keep in mind, as I said earlier, all the voters were men. So how important it was for the suffrage campaign to have men speaking out who had credible voices. And for opponents of suffrage who thought that any increase in women's rights was dangerous, immoral, anti-family, that agenda also sounds familiar to us today, I'm sorry to say. But facing that opposition, the voice of a respected faith leader was even more important. As one historian wrote, and I quote, "Women's suffrage came to rely on Wise to stump, preach, network, and write." For Stephen Wise, women voting was essential to democracy. He said, and again, here's a quote, "The votes of women will not be better than the votes of men, but better than the votes of men will be the votes of men and women together." In fact, Rabbi Wise even made a recording in 1918 when it was a very new form of media with the same title as his famous essay, Women and Democracies. You will also not be surprised to learn that not every rabbi agreed. Rabbi Wise was opposed by another prominent rabbi, Rabbi Joseph Silverman of Temple Bethel, Emmanuel, So while Rabbi Stephen Wise was campaigning for suffrage across the country, Rabbi Silverman said, "Woman has no place on the battlefield or at the ballot box." Their disagreement played out in newspapers, at meetings of CCAR, the Central Conference American rabbis, then as now the umbrella group for Reform rabbis. After years of considering and then avoiding a vote on the subject, CCAR decisively voted for suffrage in April 1917. That was an important victory for Stephen Wise and his view of democracy, and it came just in time for the greatest impact of the New York referendum. Stephen Wise went on to speak on a wide range of issues, including a call for action to protect the Jews of Europe, where sadly, as we know, he was not successful. But when I think of Rabbi Wise today, I think of one of his less well-known, but to me, bravest acts. And that was when Stephen Wise and his 10-year-old son, James, marched down Fifth Avenue behind the banner of the Men's League for Suffrage, while men on the sidewalk laughed and jeered. James carried a sign, "We want our mothers to vote." Now I'm going to go on to my fourth heroine, Maude Nathan. Now, very unlike Rosie Schneiderman, Maude Nathan came from an illustrious, old Sephardic American family. They'd been in this country for generations. Actually, she had some cousins you may have heard of. Emma Lazarus, the poet, Justice Benjamin Cardozo, again, part of that family. And with that background, Maude moved easily in social circles. As a young wife and mother, she was on the board of Mount Sinai Hospital and the Women's Municipal League, which worked for civic reform in New York City. Then, when her only child, a young daughter, died, Maude made a commitment, full-time, that she would work for social reform. She was asked to help investigate the conditions of women employees in department stores. So Maude agreed to become a member and then president of the New York Consumers League. She led an innovative campaign to win better treatment for women workers by naming companies who did the right thing, what the League called a white list, not a boycott, but a reward. And it turned out that being on the white list was good for sales. Maude Nathan lobbied for better laws to protect working women. And she realized that women would not be taken seriously until they had political rights. Her husband, Frederick, was also a member of the Men's League for Suffrage. They traveled together to international conferences where Maude translated speeches into French and German. At one international suffrage conference, she gave a speech beginning in English, then in French, and then in German. And she joined the campaign for suffrage in New York with the same dedication and creativity that she brought to the Consumers League, thinking of ways to get attention, like silent speeches, which were placards held and moved in empty store windows. 24-hour speeches with women stationed in cars around the city, new speakers every 15 minutes, and the press, because they wanted to be sure that women filled those times, the press was paying careful attention to the 24-hour speeches. As head of the 15th Assembly District of New York's Women's Suffrage Party, Maude Nathan spoke at synagogues, rallies on the Lower East Side, and beyond the state. At one rally for Jewish audiences in Philadelphia, she said, "The Jewish people, more than any other, ought to realize the benefits of freedom. Let the Jewish men of Pennsylvania be true to their traditions and vote for a square deal on election day." Now, also in the Jewish tradition, Maude's sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, loudly and publicly disagreed, to the delight of the New York newspapers, who loved covering the story of the dueling sisters. Incidentally, while Maude won the referendum in New York for suffrage, Annie Nathan Meyer, who thought education was more important as a goal, Annie Nathan Meyer won her own victory with the founding of Barnard College. Maude Nathan's effective speaking reached well beyond Jewish audiences. After she met with President Woodrow Wilson, he said to an aide, and I quote, "When I hear a woman like Mrs. Nathan talk so well on the public interest, It almost makes me believe in women's suffrage. Almost. Well, shortly after he made that comment, President Wilson himself finally endorsed suffrage. Perhaps the president, who was now a candidate for re-election, was acknowledging political reality as more and more women could now vote in Western states. But I like to think that Maude Nathan and her speech had something to do with it, and so did she. The last of my suffrage heroes is the least known, Jo Hanover of Tennessee. Perhaps you've heard about the struggle to ratify the 19th Amendment in Tennessee. It was now August 1920, after the constitutional amendment has passed in Congress, gone through the House, the Senate. 35 states have ratified. They need one more. All those years of struggle, now down to one state. It's a southern state at that, with a history of racial division. And Tennessee's powerful House Speaker, who had been a supporter, has now announced he is opposed. Rumors have it that he was reached by lobbyists for certain commercial interests, and I won't get into that, but I think one of them had the initials Jack Daniels. You may have heard that a young legislator, Harry Burns, cast the deciding vote in the Tennessee House. You almost surely have not heard of the man who made that vote possible. Jo Hanover was a new young legislator in his first term. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the leader of the fight, came to Tennessee in the summer of 1920. She knew she needed a leader in the House. Found the previous floor leader for suffrage bills was a good lawyer, but the rural legislators didn't like him. And suffrage was going to need as many of those rural votes as they could get. Carrie Catt held strategy sessions in her suite every night. And one young legislator she met there impressed her with his ideas and his personality. So Carrie Catt asked Jo Hanover to be the floor leader for suffrage. This was not an honorary title. Elaine Weiss, in her great book, The Woman's Hour, describes the scene of their deciding vote. Quote, Jo Hanover was in antic motion on the floor. He was threading between desks, grabbing elbows, thrusting his chin toward ears, confronting and cajoling delegates, end quote. Sounds like Lyndon Johnson at work, doesn't it? And like Lyndon Johnson, Jo Hanover got the votes. He also got threats, by the way. At one point, Jo was assaulted in the hotel elevator. And if you think about it, if someone's trying to beat you up in an elevator, you don't have any place to go. His assailant called him a Bolshevik and a kike. Well, when the governor of Tennessee heard about that, although Jo objected, he assigned a police captain to be his bodyguard for the rest of the session. So who was Jo Hanover, this new young legislator from Memphis, Tennessee? Well, he began as an immigrant from Poland. Again, a familiar pattern in his generation. Jo's father, Wolf, came to America first. He worked as a peddler, made enough money to send for his family, and then with his wife and 3 young sons, he buys a dry goods store in Memphis, Tennessee. Jo worked in a family store during the day and goes to law school at night. And after he passes the bar, he becomes active in local politics. As a child, Jo Hanover asked why his mother couldn't vote. It didn't seem fair to him. And when he runs for legislature, he says he is for women's suffrage. In fact, the name of that new bio by Jo Hanover that's just published, the title is, Why Can't Mother Vote? Well, after that bitter last-ditch struggle in the legislature, with Jo leading the way, Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify, and the 19th Amendment is incorporated into the United States Constitution. Esther Hanover, Jo's mother, can vote. Esther Hanover, who traveled to America from Poland with 3 young children, carrying the money for passage hidden in her shadel. Esther Hanover can vote, and so can millions of American women. Oh, those are just some. There are so many more we could discuss. Heroes of suffrage now, of voting rights now. Let's do a few quick examples. First, leaders like Lillian Wald of New York, who was the creator of public health nursing, a featured speaker at every New York suffrage event. Felice Cant, the author of the women's suffrage bill passed by the Nevada legislature in 1911 and by Nevada's voters in 1914. Judicial heroes like Justice Jenny Leutman Barron of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, the first president of the Boston University equal suffrage organization, who goes on to pass the bar at a time when women still weren't allowed on juries in Massachusetts. Gertrude Weil, a young college graduate, comes back to North Carolina after college, goes on to be president of the North Carolina League for Suffrage. Voting rights heroes like Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who came to Mississippi in 1964 to encourage voter registration and were murdered, along with their co-worker, James Chaney, an act of horrendous violence that demonstrated to the nation the need for the Voting Rights Act. And our own hero today, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who issued her scathing, prophetic dissent when the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act. I have a few heroes I can't see, but I know they're out there, and those are young Jews who today are preparing to go out and work in the states to oppose efforts of voter suppression and protect people's rights to vote. So I'll leave it at this. Throughout our history, American Jews have understood the value and the power of the right to vote. Our work on behalf of suffrage was vital to building American democracy, and it's never been more important than now. Thank you all. Thank you for joining me. Thank you once again to Lamud and to Moment, and I'm happy to take questions.
Anne, thank you so much. What a fascinating and interesting talk, and it's just such a pleasure to be able to learn all of this directly from you. While everyone takes a moment to prepare their questions, let me actually just start by asking, do you feel that Jews are sufficiently recognized for their role in the suffrage movement? And if not, why not?
One, I am sure they are not recognized. I will tell you, this is something I stumbled on because I am fascinated by the story. I think how people govern and how they choose to govern themselves is really interesting. So I have a suffrage collection at home, and if you come to the apartment, see it all over the walls. But then the more I read, the more I noticed something. As I say, there was a pattern. To me, it was unmistakable, but hadn't yet been noticed. Now, some of that is because, as you know, in my day job, I did politics. So I spent a lot of time looking at election returns. Well, when I look at the election returns for suffrage, the Jewish factor, if you will, just leaped out at me. But I went back and I found some academic articles on the subject. And one said, and I believe this is true, that yes, the suffrage leaders understood that New York was critical and that the Jews were critical in New York. But they didn't want to make a big deal of it. For one thing, they were Jews, they were immigrants, and a lot of them were socialists. And if you're trying to win a nationwide campaign, that's not necessarily who you want in the forefront. So it was understated, if you will, understood, accepted, but not talked about. No, I think we have a history here worth discovering. And by the way, the amendments in the Constitution, it's not going to get rolled back, although I think there are some politicians today who would do it if they could. But I think it's time we pull those numbers out and made a fuss about them and trumpeted them. But those books about how this or that group saved civilization? I think we can say the Jews saved suffrage. As I say, that's a legacy to be proud of.
Wonderful. Thank you. What do you think the past teaches us about women in politics today? What can we learn from the past as we look forward to the future?
First, we can learn how much power women have and do if they choose to use it. Politics is about numbers. If you can put together the majority, you can win. Women are, at this moment, a majority of the population. They don't think of themselves as the majority, and so they aren't treated as the majority. They could do more. Now, a lot of this has changed since 2018. I think the congressional results in 2018, when so many women stepped forward as candidates and won, has really helped a lot of people, women and men, understand that. I know in Washington, the atmosphere is very different from when I began, when the idea of a woman politician was, it was all right. It was sort of like being a vegetarian then. It wasn't exactly illegal, but it was unusual. Today, it is very usual. And political parties now are actively scouting, looking for women candidates. The next test will be, do those women candidates, as they get elected, have the power to make a difference for policies that will make a difference in women's lives? Again, Rosie Schneiderman, when she is out there campaigning for suffrage, it isn't because it's going to be a good bumper sticker. That's not a concept she had. But she knew that women workers, to protect themselves, need the power to vote. We still need the power to protect ourselves and our families. We have more power than we yet understand or appreciate, but we can use it.
Fern asked a really interesting question, which I'm going to read from the chat box. Which organizations, Anne, do you think are going to make a difference in voting rights in 2020?
Oh boy, that is a very good question, because voting rights has just sprung up as an issue. Foolish, naive as we were, we thought voting rights had been settled with the Voting Rights Act. We thought when young people like Mickey Goodman and Schwerner and Cheney, that they were murdered, didn't that show us how important the Voting Rights Act was? And we would build from there and cherish their legacy. And instead, we have had in the last 10 years a concerted effort to chip away at the Voting Rights Act. You've got a Supreme Court decision that weakened it. That's, as I say, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's eloquent dissent. Anyone who is interested, go look up Justice Ginsburg's dissent on the majority opinion in the Voting Rights Act. So what you've got now are two sets of organizations. One, some of the traditional organizations, like the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. The NAACP has always been terrific on voting rights. There are now some Latino organizations that are very good. But what's more interesting, I think, are the new ones, because they're almost springing up, noticing what's happened. So you've got something like Let America Vote, I think is the title. Two or three more. I want to be sure I'd have their titles right. I know they're new, and I'm reading about them every day and hearing from them. I'm enormously impressed. There's one lawyer, Mark Elias, who again has been doing a terrific job. I believe his principal client is the Democratic National Committee, but he's been going out there on behalf of a number of states and fighting, again, for the rights, simple rights, like being able to vote by mail at a time when we're having a pandemic and people's lives are at stake. Here's how different and scorched earth almost these tactics have become. The voters in Florida in 2016, right, adopt a referendum, it's on the ballot, initiative that restores voting rights to felons, to a class of people who, though they had been in jail, are now out, and yet they're still not allowed to vote. And so the citizens of Florida, by a sizable majority, vote that they should be, again, have their voting rights restored. And what happens is the Florida legislature is trying to chip away over and over, now saying, well, you can't really have your voting rights restored unless you pay fines, unless you restore, right, certain economic measures, whatever it is you were fined years ago. Well, if you've been in jail for 10 years, if you've been in jail for 8 years, you probably don't have a lot of ready cash to settle a court. in court. And so they're trying to find more and more ways to keep people from voting. It is an everyday fight, as tough on both sides now as the fight for candidates. The good news is that I think people now understand that. And so state by state, the names of the organizations will vary, but in every state, you're going to find an organization that will include both elected and non-elected people who are out there fighting to be sure everybody's got the right to vote and those votes will be counted.
Someone's getting email. I'm gonna turn to Greg now, who's gonna ask the next question. Greg, you're unmuted. No, you're not. Now you are.
In 1984, when Walter Mondale chose Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate, it didn't seem to shift the women's vote in favor of the Democrats more than had he chosen a male vice president. Why was that?
I think because when it is rare that vice presidential candidates make much of a difference. Really, you can go all the way back to Jack Kennedy in 1960. Yes, Lyndon Johnson delivered Texas. He becomes the model. It hasn't happened since. So chances are when people go to vote, as we've learned from hard experience, they vote for president. The choice of vice president is symbolic. It can help get people excited, but it doesn't move the direction of votes enough. Now, I think we're in a different place this year because Joe Biden said in advance of the convention that he was going to choose a woman. So you've got the opportunity people to get used to the idea. We've now had women candidates. It doesn't seem such a, again, change from the norm. I think it is more likely to have an impact this year, but you're right about 1984. I remember that convention. I remember our hopes were high. And then when we went back out and measured voters, they were still voting for their choice for president.
Thank you, Greg. We're going to now turn to a question from Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much. You've inspired countless generations of women to get involved politically and civilly. So
I couldn't say anything I would like to hear more. Thank you.
It's an honor. As I know, and I've seen with your work personally, the importance of bipartisanship can't be stressed enough. So I'm wondering, as so many of us crave a return to values-based, solution-oriented conversations across the aisle, what are your suggestions and how can we work to bringing civility back to the conversation?
First, start locally. It is easier to have bipartisan conversations, and by the way, practical conversations at the local level, because that's where the problems are real. You can find people on both sides, every side if you'd like, who will agree we've got to get this done. So I'd say start locally, including state legislatures, municipal government. Right now, national politics is much more polarized and harder to crack. But partly because so much attention is on national politics, that leaves much more room at the state and local level. Look at your state legislatures, look at county governments, look at municipal governments, look for people who can be partners. Start there because that pendulum will swing back. And if you start now, you'll be ready to take advantage of it.
We have time for, I think, one more question. I'm wondering if there is a volunteer of someone who would like to ask, or if not, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask something myself. But I'm going to give y'all 3 more seconds. Judith, it's been incredible watching you paint while we are learning. And I hope I didn't just embarrass you, but it's been remarkable, and I hope you'll share. And you know, we're going into, well, we continue, you know, along the lines of the question that was just asked, right? We're in an unbelievably polarized and complicated political environment. And I wonder what, as people who care about women's rights and women's suffrage movement, as you've described it, and Jewish involvement in pushing society or our country or our countries towards more open, inclusive places. I wonder what advice you might leave us with in these difficult days as we look to a new election cycle and look to continuing to push forward this holy work that you've taught us about for the last hour.
Well, I'd say first, think for a moment, Jews take our citizenship seriously. That's good news. We do not take it for granted. Even the youngest generations, David, even you yourself, will understand that the choice of who governs is important for all of us. And partly, I believe that is because for thousands of years in exile, Jews were at the mercy of governments for which we were at best outsiders, right? At best, they were disinterested, and at worst, as we know, we were enemies. We were capable of dual loyalty. We could not be trusted. So we come to the United States, and from the very beginning, from George Washington's letter, right, to the synagogue in Rhode Island, we are welcome here as citizens, and we have made the most of that opportunity. We have cherished it. I think that's why you so often find Jews on the front lines, as you do in suffrage, as you did later in civil rights, on expanding rights for others. We know that citizenship is valuable. Second, and that's the good news, and I think that's going to continue. Second is now take your power seriously. Think about the changes you can make. If those women in 1915, if Rosie Schneiderman at 4'9", who doesn't speak English until she's, well, certainly more than 10 when she gets to this country, winds up having lunch at the White House, right? Winds up organizing in national political campaigns. If Rosie Schneiderman can do it, if Joe Hanover, again, another immigrant from Poland, right? They come to this country probably with help from a bootlegger who supplemented his income by bringing people across illegally. If he can come and get elected to the Tennessee legislature and be there at that moment and go all out for suffrage, think how much potential each of us has. And I would add, that would be my third point, at a time in this country when immigrants are being so attacked and criticized. Of the 4 people I highlighted, I realized later 3 of them were immigrants. That's right. The greatest extension of voting rights in America, because we doubled our democracy in one day with the 19th Amendment, that greatest extension was in large part supported by immigrants who took democracy seriously, sometimes more seriously than people who'd always had it. So think about what each of us can do. Each of us has the power to do. And I do believe as American Jews, beyond our parallel, again, family relationship in Israel, we as American Jews, as citizens, have more power, more ability to make change than certainly anywhere in our history, in our Jewish history that you've been studying these days. Think how you're going to use it. Make the most of it.
And with the 30 seconds we've got left, I'd be remiss without asking you this, that even though we are an inclusive, diverse platform and community, what are your political predictions in 2020?
Oh, I don't want to undermine your C3 status here. I was trying to be good.
We're not endorsing, we're just asking you your thoughts.
I'm feeling pretty good about a change in leadership this time. I think some of what we tried to say hypothetically might happen in 2016 actually has happened. It's hard to get people concerned about hypotheticals, but when it's real, then they notice. And so I think we're going to be able to come back to people and say, this is about you, it's about your family, it's about your children. We need a change in national leadership for their sake. We have a stronger case to make this year than we did 4 years ago. And I know so many people have made the commitment that this year we're going to try it. We're going to do it. After all, what would be the purpose in having the vote if we didn't go all out to make a difference?